Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. Today is the Decarbonization Day on the IPCC Pavilion. We will talk today on this panel about decarbonizing society. Decarbonization is one of the biggest challenges in order to address the climate crisis. In this panel discussion, experts will analyze the existing solutions, the difficulties, and the need of actors from the public, private, civil society, and decision-making sectors to work in coordination to meet the challenge. Today's panel is constituted by experts with different sectoral and thematic interests. We start from my left. Mr. Jonathan Barton is a geographer and economic historian who works in the Institute of Geography in the Catholic University in Santiago and was founding director of the Chilean Center for Sustainable Urban Development, CEDEUS, a collaboration between Catholic University and the University of Concepcion. He works in two main fields. The first is urban development with a focus on politics and planning instruments and climate change mitigation and adaptation. The second is local sustainable development in areas where export-oriented activities are concentrated, mining, forestry, and salmon aquaculture sectors. I continue with Fernando González. He's the CEO of Cerro Dominador and the president of the Chilean Association for Concentrating Solar Power. Cerro Dominador is building the first concentrating solar power in Latin America, 110 megawatts with 17.5 hours of storage, combined with 100 megawatts of photovoltaics. The project will be completed in mid-2020, and it is expected to open the door for new projects in the country that will provide 24/7 clean, flexible, renewable power. Mr. González has over 20 years of experience in the global power industry, having held executive positions in the Dorado Group, Contour Global, and the IES Corporation. Ms. Paz Araya, Master in Energy Economics, 12 years experience in energy policies analysis, energy education, and energy efficiency solutions. Researcher from the Energy Poverty Network at University of Chile and the Energy Center from the same name university. She has been part of academic support for policy making through prospective, input generation, conducting discussion between stakeholders, and assessing mechanisms, measures, and programs. We have also today with us Yuri Rogel. He's a climate scientist, a lecturer in climate change at Imperial College London in the United Kingdom. He was one of the coordinating lead authors of the IPCC special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees and is currently a lead author for the IPCC 6th assessment report. His expertise is in societal transformation pathways that link what we know about our planet to climate and energy policy. He's also a member of the UN Secretary General's Climate Summit Science Advisory Group. Thank you. Ms. Eve Crowley from FAO. She's a United States national with a long career in institutional matters, research, and development across many countries and international organizations. Since October 2013, Ms. Crowley has been FAO Deputy Regional Representative for Latin America and the Caribbean and FAO representative in Chile. Since her arrival at FAO headquarters in Rome, Italy, she has worked in the areas of poverty eradication, institutional strengthening, sustainable livelihood, sustainable rural development, agriculture, and rural employment. So, Mrs. Crowley. Ms. Crowley has a degree in government and anthropology from Smith College and a PhD in anthropology from Yale University, United States. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. So to start to listen to these experts on this interesting topic, I would like that each of you can highlight one positive experience of decarbonization and one barrier, hopefully in 5 minutes each. So we start with Jonathan.
Thank you, Anna Maria. Good morning, everybody. My positive experience, I would say, I'm going to put under the title Planetary Urbanization, and I'll lead that onto footprints, carbon footprinting. And the major barrier, what I would call the urban Stockholm syndrome, or if you like, the planetary Stockholm syndrome that we're suffering at the moment in relation to carbon. I work principally on urban issues and metropolitan planning in Chile and Latin America. So planetary urbanization and where we're going with that discussion in urban theory and how it links to climate change and carbon decarbonization. Back in the 1960s, Henri Lefebvre talked about planetary urbanization by basically saying that the whole planet is moving towards being urban. We're all urban. Moving beyond the distinction between urban and rural. And more recently, Neil Brenner has taken up that banner again and talked about the need to talk about continuities and not these rather artificial separations between what is urban, rural, and peri-urban. And why is this important? Is because when we think about cities and municipal authorities, metropolitan authorities, is where does their reach get to? How far can they actually control? Where do their planning instruments, where do their policy instruments actually reach out to? And when we're thinking about carbon management and thinking about materials, water, energy, waste, migration, and food, clearly we can't think about urban boundaries as we generally have worked with in urban theory and urban planning. So when we think about cities being the principal direct and indirect generators of 70 to 80% of greenhouse gases, we clearly have to think beyond what we traditionally thought of as the city. So the city for me, and along the same lines as Lefebvre and Brenner, is this concentration of people who depend on lots of other places. And so, whereas I don't favor the idea that we talk about everything being in the urban, it seems a very irrespectful or disrespectful way of treating people in rural places and who regard themselves as being rural, having a closer tie to the land, we do need to think about cities transcending those boundaries. So this takes us back to footprints. And I think whereas when we think about the ecological footprint of Ries and Wackernagel, that had a carbon component, and that we've been working on that for several years. And while we talk about the carbon footprint and working more precisely on that with the greenhouse gas protocol, for example, that was developed 5 years ago with WRI, ICLE, and others. And myself, on our own work, we've been doing footprinting for the metropolitan region of Santiago, the region of Antofagasta, and I just come back from Rapa Nui, Easter Island, where we're doing a carbon footprint there, because you can't do carbon planning, you can't do climate planning without carbon footprints. And the problem was before we had this universal protocol, we were all doing footprinting in different ways. I was working, for example, with material flow analysis, with ecological footprint, and also genuine progress indices. So in a sense, when we move towards common methodologies, it helps us a lot in trying to think about how to convince planners and municipal administrators to actually do something about it. Because while we're arguing about the details of the methodologies, they're not doing anything, basically. So when we think about the SDG 11 on cities, in particular about risk and disaster, that's one side of the coin, but we must think about cities as being the principal drivers of climate change, effectively, through their demand and consumption patterns. So if we want to tackle decarbonization, we have to think about new types of cities, new types of use of space, new types of buildings, new types of industries and transport. And so the three scopes of any of these protocols involve the direct emissions that emerge from the city. And that's easy to deal with. But it's just such a small percentage of what we're talking about when we're talking about what the footprints of these cities are. We have to include the indirect goods and services carbon footprints of these cities, and we have to think about the grid. When we think about different sources of energy generation, particularly thermal energy, we need to bring them in and say this is the city that's producing this demand. So I think the very positive thing is we are moving to carbon footprinting, and I think municipal authorities and municipal leaders are actually understanding that once we have these footprints and there's a universal methodology, we can actually move forward and saying, how are you going to deal with it? What is the target? At the moment, I would say in Chile, I can't think of any examples that we have where we have a target at the urban or regional level to actually reduce carbon as a trans-sectoral policy. And the Stockholm Syndrome, briefly, in a couple of minutes, is the fact that when we think about modern cities or the industrial cities from the 18th century onwards, they are tied to fossil fuels. So when we think about cities, we're generally locked into a particular view of cities and fossil fuel use. And so it's very difficult to think out of the envelope, out of the box. And when you try and do this and talk about cities in other terms, you're regarded as being slightly special, to put it in a nice term, and otherwise you're regarded as being very green or very red. And it's very difficult to engage with a whole range of actors. And I think part of this Stockholm Syndrome is actually reinforced by the fact that we are talking about very, very strong urban interests around the carbon economy. When you go around any streets in any city and you see the petrol stations, you see the tire sellers, you see the repair shops, you see a whole range of urban assets, artifacts that are involved in the urban carbon economy. So there's tremendous resistance to change or the speed of change. And we did a study for NEL in Santiago looking at the opportunities for electromobility, and it's still very, very small. And in a sense, I think it's small because there is tremendous resistance, and I can talk about that later on. And just to finalize, three basic problems we have linked with three principles of economics and urban change. One is the Jevons paradox. Goes back to an economist and the British economists in the 50s. If you reduce the price of carbon, people will use the equivalent amount. You don't change it, but yet the price mechanism works in odd ways. So we need to be very careful. When governments subsidize carbon, we get more use of carbon. The second is Pigouvian taxes. A.C. Pigou, the sort of, if you like, the father of environmental economics. I mention his name because we were both born in the same town, in the same island. And the fact is that we're not using Pigouvian taxes as we should do. We're not internalizing externalities. At the moment in Chile, we passed a law 2 years ago that says that carbon is worth $5. It needs to be worth $50 if we're thinking about trying to compensate really the impact of that. And lastly, the Cousins curve, which works very well in cities by saying we need to grow, we need very strong urban economies, and we'll deal with social ecological issues afterwards. I think we all know that the Cousins curve does not work. And cities need to move well beyond that logic and think in very different ways. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Jonathan. About the expertises of the panel, I would suggest we continue with Paz, then Yuri, then Eve, and then Fernando. And then we do another turn, and you can comment each other, yeah? Paz?
Okay, thank you. Well, I think it's kind of hard to talk about positive and negative situation, part of decarbonization, because the positive part that it's an urgent thing. Decarbonization is urgent, we need that, but the positive thing that is that it's possible. We can do it. We have the technologies. We have the sciences behind this. But I want to go in deep in the negative part, or maybe the challenge about decarbonization, because I think decarbonization is not a matter of just technological development. I think, and here and there in Chile, we have a very good example, and because why it is not just a technological thing. The current situation in Chile is a very good example of why inequality has to be taken part of the decarbonization plans. I think, well, it's the current situation in Chile and other countries, Ecuador, Colombia, and other parts too. And all these have the same origin. I think it's an economic model based on unlimited and discriminated exploitation of resources, which determines our power relations. And we have to take that on part when we talk about decarbonization. It's not a coincidence that is the wealthiest population, the 10% wealthiest, responsible for more than half of greenhouse gas emissions. And at the same time, the richest 20% of the population earn 80% of the world income. So also the most economical, vulnerable population who is most vulnerable to effects of climate change. I think I'm going to take a specific example from Chile to illustrate this. I think inequality is reflected in high levels of segregation and gentrification, with significant contrast of urbanization between socioeconomical groups. Thus, while in the same city, some families can afford the living standards of high development countries, in the same city, other lives in precarious conditions, with direct impact in dynamics like energy, water, and all the resources demand. Adding to this, the situation of a poorly regulated market, which result with people receiving the externalities of projects, inequalities just continue to deepen. I think this is why energy transition and decarbonization is such a complex problem, because we live in a society involving a competition between different forms of organization, practices, infrastructure, due to the coexistence of very heterogeneous system, supply services, and weak policies and vulnerable population. So, taking an example, decarbonization is possible, yes, but decarbonization initiatives could deepen inequalities. An action that is being evaluated in Chile is electrification of residential heating. Putting in context, Chile is in the southern part of Chile. We have cold weather. People use firewood for heating. And firewood is also responsible for high emission of air pollutants. So, yeah, we can imagine a nice future with solar electricity and electric heating for all of southern part. It sounds very, very nice for us. But let's take a look further. About these complex interrelations. First, right now, this year, in Chile, we have one of the most expensive tariff for electricity. I know that can change with solar energy, but this is the situation right now. And electricity is 5 to 6 times more expensive than cheap and popular firewood. But worse, 66% of our houses do not meet adequate thermal conditions for the prevailing cold weather in the southern part of the country. So what happens if, in order to decarbonize our energy matrix, we force technological replacement for heating without taking part of the deep coordination between agents? How we take care about inequality. I think in this context where energy poverty in the case of Chile is manifested mainly through the poor quality of energy services, pollutant, inefficient, unreliable, the lack of institutional coordination and power asymmetries can block the adoption of measures, increasing habitability problems or increasing expenses of the families, who have to expense also in health, education, and other basic services. So having finally a negative impact. I'm finishing right now. But I'm not referring only to the application of a mix of policies, but a real coordination between institutions, stakeholders, and for us, the scientists, an transdisciplinary cooperation. This is, I think, is the only way to resolve this. The only way which allows us to dialogue between us and taking charge of this complex problem, involving resources, supply, infrastructure, technologies, institutions, skills, knowledge, and behavior. I think it's the only way to about encouraging new forms of inequality and injustice.
Thank you, Paz. Very interesting. Jury, can you illustrate us, please?
Thanks. I think I'm the only one cheating a bit. We were asked to present 5 minutes of introduction, and I got some slides. Let's try to change them. Yeah, if we can. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I just wanted to give you some context based on my work for the IPCC 1.5 degree special report that looks at limiting warming to 1.5 and also at the impacts. That report that came out last year showed that to limit warming to 1.5, really huge reductions in greenhouse gas emissions are required already in the next decade. By 2030, we need a roughly 50% reduction relative to 2010 of greenhouse gas of carbon dioxide, and interestingly, and then by mid-century we would get to net zero to limit warming to 1.5. If we can go to the next slide. So, yeah, thank you. So the question really becomes, how can we achieve these 1.5 degree consistent reductions, knowing that the idea of achieving 1.5 degrees or limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is not just about achieving that number, but it's really about avoiding the impacts that have been projected once we go beyond 1.5. The report clearly says that it's not like there's a cliff at 1.5, but every tenth of a degree matters. With every tenth of a degree that we warm above 1.5, risks increase. And so how can this be done? The IPCC gives this one sentence. Thank you. Limiting warming to 1.5 degree would require rapid, far-reaching changes on an unprecedented scale. And that's a very vague statement, but each of the bolded words in this sentence really means something particular. The rapid refers to in the next decade. By 2030, we need to have seen the changes have happened. So emission reductions need to have occurred, changes in society need to have occurred in order for us to have a reasonable chance to limit warming to 1.5. Far-reaching, and I think this panel is a good example of this, is that change needs to happen in all systems, in the way that we produce energy, in the way that we use the land for agriculture or to produce the products that we use, the way we design our cities, the way we build our houses, and also the way we produce our products. And then finally, on an unprecedented scale, and I think again, this panel is an example of it, limiting warming to 1.5, and honestly, even 2 degrees wouldn't change this picture very much, if at all. We need stringent action everywhere. In each of those sectors, we need stringent action. So none of these sectors is off the hook. So this is clearly a challenge, and we were asked to present some of the positive experiences. And so my background is in societal transformation modeling, long-term emission scenarios, and so on. And I think one positive decarbonization example is illustrated by these 2 figures, and it's basically that, and this is about annual photovoltaics additions in the energy system, where on the left-hand side here, you can see the black line is the actual the actual deployment of photovoltaics over time, and the other lines, it was the International Energy Agency has been projecting every year, and they were every year too conservative. Now, the International Energy Agency isn't the only one. On the right-hand side, you can see another plot from a study where it's kind of the same kind of plot. The red line is the actual observed installed capacity, and the other lines are different studies. Now, this is not just the International Energy Agency, but it includes Greenpeace, which can hardly be accused of being too conservative. And even there, reality has always outpaced what we thought as modelers. So I think this is a really positive example of how decarbonization of our society can go faster than we think. Then if we think about the barriers, I first want to start with a positive note, and that also comes out of the 1.5 degree special report, and that the mitigation choices, or the choices about which strategies we pursue to reduce our emissions, can either support or counteract our efforts to attain sustainable development. But importantly, we also find many, many synergies between achieving a low carbon development and sustainable development, particularly demand side measures that reduce the amount of energy we use, the amount of products we use, or the amount of land we use, have been shown to maximize synergies with sustainable development. The big barrier here is that there are important barriers to the implementation of these demand side measures. They require behavioral change. They often are characterized by what is called split incentives. The person that would need, or that is affected by the measure, is not the one that pays for it, and so on. So this is really the big barrier that I think we need to solve, and I hope that also other members on this panel can also comment on that later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yves?
So I would like to talk about a beautiful but very dirty secret. Very dirty. And that's soils. Soils. The largest terrestrial pool of carbon. It holds twice the pool, just in the top meter, twice the carbon that is held in the atmosphere. And at the same time, this dirty but marvelous substance provides 95% of our food. So it's performing an incredibly powerful function. And yet a third of all soils are degraded severely or moderately. And since the last century, the actual agricultural soils have lost between 50 and 70% of all of their carbon stock. This has a cost. It has a cost for 3.2 billion people. It has a cost of gross product globally of 10%, and it has a cost of trillions of dollars. The 10% cost for globally is associated with the loss in biodiversity and the loss in ecosystem services. So this is a very powerful substance for us. And the interesting thing is last week, Ratan Lal, the Nobel laureate, basically made the point that it is actually recarbonization of soil to decarbonize society is a feasible solution. It is within our reach. And in fact, rehabilitating agricultural and degraded soils has the capability of capturing all the emissions of 2018. So this is not just a dirty secret. This is actually something that is enormously powerful for us. And I would like to talk about one particular successful experience. This is the Initiative for Recarbonization of Global Soils. Basically, what it is about is a market-based mechanism that helps us to scale up sustainable soil management practices that are focused on carbon in exchange for offsetting global emissions in the aviation industry. And currently, the aviation international aviations are responsible for 1.3% of all anthropogenic carbon emissions. Now, there's been a lot of progress in aviation emissions, and particularly in the technological and operational side, but there's still a big gap to try to reach the targets. And this recarbonization of soils initiative is working on carbon offsetting and reduction scheme of international aviations and working with corporate social responsibility as well. And basically what it does is it's trying to prevent carbon loss in carbon-rich soils. We're talking about peat bogs, we're talking about permafrost, black soils, and enhancing carbon in agricultural and degraded soils. And this is an inclusive approach. We work with governments and also with farmers. So it doesn't need to be hugely expensive. In fact, while much of the time decarbonization initiatives can enhance inequalities, in this case we're also talking about sometimes very simple technologies but have to be practiced on a massive scale, like mulching and crop cover and managing manure and soil organic materials, agroforestry, soil erosion control. And this initiative is building capacities for people to be able to do this, for farmers to be able to do this. It's building incentive systems for them to actually work on sequestering carbon in their soils and building monitoring of these systems. It also helps to support the whole improvement of the data that we have about soils and our capacities to harmonize methods across countries and to monitor how soil carbon is being captured and improving laboratory standards. And all of this helps us to move towards land degradation neutrality. It contributes also to the Aichi targets relating to soil biodiversity, and it contributes to the nationally determined contributions. Barrier. I would only focus on one here, which is the need for farmer-friendly incentive schemes to mobilize voluntary contributions, hopefully from private funding, for voluntary carbon offsets and for blended investments in climate change adaptation and mitigation. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit more. It's interesting that in the Chile case, which it was one of the countries, the few countries, it's the only country in Latin America that does not protect soils. It is one of the few countries in the OECD that does not do so. There's no law that tries to protect soils in Chile. So now that we have this opportunity for a new dialogue in the country brought about by civil disagreement with how things have been run over the last decades, we also have an opportunity to revisit this within the national constitution to recognize soils as a public good in and of itself. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So Fernando has a presentation.
Yes.
The
So
computer
you're not the only one cheating here. Yes, I am Fernando González. I'm the CEO of Cerro Dominador. This is a recent picture of the plant where you can see the array of mirrors for the CSP plant, and in the back, 38 megawatts of the PV project. So when we think about positives and negatives for this, I'd like to talk a little bit about the technology. So in our plant, we have, as I mentioned, 100 megawatts of PV and 110 megawatts of CSP. The beauty of the CSP is that it has 17 and a half hours of storage, which is basically allowing us to generate solar power 24 hours a day. And that's very important because we see this technology as enabling the introduction of other variable renewable energies. So this is our project. In terms of the technology, the advantages of this is that you can design, you can have a flexible design, you can design for the number of hours of storage that the system needs. the size of the turbine that the system needs. It can be combined with other renewables. There's a lot of discussion on hybridizing CSP with PV to reduce the cost of the power. It's cost competitive, and this is very important in Chile, where we have some of the best resources in terms of solar radiation in the world, where you don't have natural gas resources or coal resources, and you have to import the gas. This is competitive, definitely with gas, and this is even before incorporating the externalities that were described here as part of the cost. And as such, this is the ideal replacement for baseload power in Chile. So on the positive side, we can see here, this is the, by the way, I'm not original here. I took 2 slides from a seminar we organized early this year in Chile. These 2 slides are coming from the Ministry of Energy. And the first one shows the growth of the demand and the impact of coal, but you can see that in the last few years there has been a significant increase in renewal. All the areas at the top of the chart are showing those are pretty much renewable energy that have been added to the system. That's helping us. That's setting the base on which we can build to become more green. But the most interesting part is that as a result of those renewals, the prices, the electricity prices came down. So it's a positive. It's a double positive. You have clean energy and you have lower prices. And then the second one shows the high potential of the renewable energies, at least in Chile. So this is also part of the analysis from the ministry. And you can see here that there's 60 times the current installed capacity in Chile for renewable energy. So there's no, on the positive side, there's no technical, there's no limitation to a fully decarbonization of the energy matrix in Chile. And this is, I think it's a conservative. There's a different study that adds about half a terawatt of additional renewable energy capacity. So on the bright side, there is the technology, there are the resources, so this is something that can be done. So, but in terms of challenges, I think what we need is to have, I divide it into 3 categories. The first one is ambition and decision. So we need to have an ambitious goal. And Chile does have an ambitious goal, but it has to be even more aggressive in terms of closing the coal-fired units. We cannot wait until 2040 to close all the coal-fired units. We have the technology, and it can be done earlier. And there has to be execution. It has to be decided at the governmental level. The second one is we still need to work on a good alignment of objectives and incentives. I'm a father, and I know that when you want to get something done, you have to have the proper incentives with the kids, and this is not different than that. With the resources there, my concern is that if the incentives and the rules are not clear, we may be missing the opportunity here. We may, for not having the right allocation of costs to externalities, the right regulatory framework, we may be missing, we may be delaying this opportunity. So once you have the objective, we need to set up what are the rules that will get us there. And finally, we need to think collaborative. We need to work together, and we need to think outside the box. This is a matter of trade-offs, and those of us who are in business, we know that we cannot get everything, so we have to do trade-offs all the time. So and there's some people will not be happy and some others will be happy. So it's a matter of finding the common ground to execute this and get it done. So those are my slides. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, that was a very interesting introduction. I think we will run out of time very soon. So I propose that we do another round on the same order so you can comment the other's presentation and also deep a little bit on your ideas. And then we would like to have some questions from the audience. Anyway, I have to say, most of you have said a message that we have to do things differently. And this is a message that is coming in every panel we had about indigenous people, about women in science, about industrial innovation. So I think we must deep on this, how to collaborate better, how to change on a better way. So Jonathan, maybe you can tell us how can cities be a solution and not the problem?
Thanks. The New Urban Agenda, which was launched in Quito, the Habitat 3, puts climate change right up there amongst the urban challenges. And when we make that co-benefit relation with what Paz was saying about local contamination, we're clearly, it's a win-win all round. And what bothers me is and Fernando mentioned it, is the delay and how we're defining incentives and disincentives. I think about 8 years ago now, we approved, the Ministry of Energy approved a law about homes feeding back into the grid. And the regulation that actually enacts that still hasn't been consolidated. And this is due to resistance by firms who are in generation, transmission, distribution. So I think we are battling against institutionalized interests. And this goes back to my Stockholm syndrome about cities, and we're locked in. And we're locked into certain companies that dominate these markets. And when we're thinking about what municipal and metropolitan authorities do regarding water and energy, well, it's very difficult in many countries because these have been privatized, in Latin America in particular. So this has to be done over long periods of time, long negotiations. Even in terms of waste contracts, in Chile, companies have waste municipalities, which have the legal obligation to deal with solid municipal domestic waste, have contracts of 12 and 15 years, and these contracts do not give any incentive to reduce the volume of that waste. So we have a real struggle in terms of how the firms that dominate these natural monopolies are actually working with or blocking some of the ideas. So if you like, I think at the global level we have these initiatives. We try and ground them through national policy. But when you get into the subnational politics of this, we really do need more collaboration. And these firms have their own interests, and they have shareholders, and they have to show returns and profits. So I think there's a real challenge there in how you deal with these vested interests in an old model. We're talking about an old model that was very well established in the 20th century, and the new model that we're all thinking about and imagining, it's very difficult to change when you've got a business model for the city that's already locked in. So we do need to think very creatively about this, and we need to think about when we renew concessions for some of these natural monopolies, what are the conditions of those concessions? In Chile, there's been progress into working towards a cleaner public transport system. The Trans-Santiago, which is Santiago's main transportation system, the whole metro now is actually clean energy. They have a contract with solar and wind energy suppliers, so the metro system is actually clean. And so when we had the collapse in the Chilean system, the social crisis about the price of travel, in a sense, it's the price of travel there in terms of clean travel. So that's another issue that Paz touched on. And when we're thinking about the big firms and their domination and control of the system, there is also an issue about individuals and about climate justice and who pays for what. And just the proportion of that people pay, the energy poverty dimension, is tremendously important in this. So whether it's the protests in Ecuador that preceded the Chilean protests or the Gilets jaunes or whatever, there's clearly a distributive justice issue here that you just don't resolve by pumping up energy charges. So there's a real challenge there. My particular issue, what I'm interested in terms of research, is metropolitan planning and land use planning. And in a sense, what we did in the 20th century was say, using the US suburban model, you can live wherever you like and we'll connect you. And when we want compact cities to deal with contamination, to give people time back that this model of the city takes from them effectively, we need to really say to people, well, this is the transport system. We will connect you with public transport. We're not going to finance private transport. And certainly in Chile, we haven't made that switch yet. And there's tremendous resistance to that. People want to be linked. They think they have a right, a freedom to move, and that the state has to guarantee them their right to move in their own cars and to locate wherever they like. And that comes not from low-income groups. That comes from high-income groups. So we need to generate transformation in those who can pay and change their mindset in order for others to be liberated from their particular restrictions. Because the lower income groups that are forced to use public transport, we want everybody using public transport, and we want that public transport to be clean. So we are locked into a very old-fashioned model, and in a sense we have to really get into the politics of this and the interests and ask why the big companies aren't doing many favors or are restricting the velocity of that change that we know we all need very quickly.
Thank you. So, Paz, yeah?
Thank you. I think there are two main ideas here in the panel. One is about cooperation, and the other one is about how urgent is this. Is the thing, it's time for acting, right? And it's what is getting us together here. I think it have become urgent, and our social and climate crisis is making this point. People is in the streets demanding for actions, and I think people is anger with the whole reason to be anger, and I think this is the big opportunity to make the change happen. Taking again the example of the social crisis in Chile, since the social crisis started, people start to talk a lot, but a lot. It's amazing. People is reuniting in the streets, in the parks, to talk about what we want and how we want. And I think that is an important issue. Let's take the anger, let's take the urgency to make the things happen. And I think a crisis is a big opportunity. And you said it very well. We have now the opportunity to change our constitution and to change the things that are wrong. The energy, water, the soul is not a right for us.
Paz, on that aspect, do you think education is a important topic on this moment?
Absolutely. It's one of the biggest answers. And I think it's dialogue. It's part of the dialogue. Dialogue is not just to come together and talk about what is going on. I think dialogue is dialogue between institutions, is dialogue through the education. I think is make the people talk more and think more about what we want. And it's dialogue, again, I said it before, but between disciplines. I think we need to talk between people for science, nature science, engineering, geography, social sciences. We all need to talk more about how we can coordinate it in the solution.
Yeah, a few reflections. I think I'm really happy with this panel. I mean, it's so diverse, and it really reflects all the different aspects or many of the aspects that one would need it in order to get this kind of decarbonization and transformation of society. I think being here and having two speakers after me, I actually just want to use this position to already ask two questions to these persons. And the first would be to Yves. I mean, soils are such an important part of our society, and they provide such a service. And I was really intrigued by what you described as a way to offset affiliation emission with carbon in soils. When I personally am always very uncomfortable when one tries to kind of balance or offset a committed emission in the atmosphere with a permanent responsibility to keep that carbon in the soil, and particularly in the context of a changing climate, where we expect higher disturbances to soil because we are just not so well prepared. So I wanted to ask, what is your like expert opinion on how vulnerable soils are for that carbon to be disturbed again afterwards? And then also in how far it is, we are not really speaking just about mitigation now, but really about mitigation and adaptation as two components of increasing resilience. And then, okay, so that would be my question. And then I also had a question to Fernando. So in Europe, we also have CSPs, but they haven't really been taking off as much as I would have hoped. Do you have any lessons learned there what was the context in which it didn't work in Europe, and why, and what would be in your context in Chile would be why could it work there?
Well, I'm an anthropologist. I'm not a soil scientist. So I'm not actually an expert on this. But we do know that since agriculture feeds the world, and that the world's population will be increasing by 2.2 billion till 2050, this means that we're going to need to increase food production by 49%. And it means that if nothing's done, there will be an increase of 60% of emissions just associated with the increase in production. What this means is that to produce, unless we change the way we use soils and the way we produce, there's a strong likelihood that there will continue to be disturbance on soils that will continue to emit. So we need to change things fundamentally. And it is indeed very complex. I'd like to pick up a little bit on what Jonathan was saying about the rural-urban linkages, because, and also what Paz was saying about inequality, because if we look across the agricultural sector, what we're talking about when we're talking about feeding people is the whole connection between rural and urban areas, and how to make sure that urban areas have the food that they need, but not just the food, but the right kind of food. Because we also have an obesity syndemic, not just in Chile, in the world. So we need to change what we're eating. Some societies are still eating traditional foods which are actually better in terms of their carbon footprint, and local foods, but some are not. And we need to change our diets. We need to be eating a planet-healthy diet, which requires cultural changes as well. Much more fruits and vegetables and legumes and whole grains, and less meat and animal products. And that is a difficult message, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean, where there's such a strong culture of meat consumption. But we also know that livestock is one of the big emitters. 50% of all greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture comes from livestock, and 60% of that 50% is just cattle. So that is another huge thing we have to deal with. So how do we decarbonize livestock management? You know, we can improve the probiotics of what livestock consume. Seaweed, a good product of Chile, is also good for cattle. and also converting methane into bioenergy. Those are some of the things for livestock. But we really need to change and educate consumers to consume more sustainable diets. We also need, the other linkage here is food loss and waste. There's loss at the side of production, there's waste at the side of consumption, and all along that chain, the amount of emissions that come from food loss and waste is 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So this is really an important thing, and that requires, again, education of all the people along that value chain. The other thing is that these supply chains, we need much better emissions accounting along the chain, and for private industry to have incentives to account for their emissions along the chain. And of course, there are other things like restoration of, enhancing carbon sinks through restoration and sustainable forest management, but also getting those incentives right to actually adopt better technologies. There's a lot to be done, and in fact, it's going to be a big challenge because we've got such a complexity of actors on the food chain. And to really do this, it means changing the way we produce, distribute, and consume food. And that is a big call. And to actually to decarbonize by 2060, it will be difficult. But you have to start. We have no choice. Chile's is one of the problems that distinguishes Chile on the soils front is that the soils are contaminated, just like what you were saying. They are contaminated, and that contamination comes from the bigger industry, the big players, not the small. And in fact, even the data has this distortion that all the data on soil was available only from the 25% highly intensified soil uses by large producers. And so recently we've managed to create the first inclusive soil database for Chile, and that's expanded the ability to see how soil carbon is being sequestered along this extreme climate variant, which represents the country. And that has expanded access by 10 times by the public. So there are some positive things, but there's a real challenge. I can't say that I have all the answers.
Thank you. Fernando, please.
Yes, so I'd like to address Yori's question. There are two things that differentiate Chile from Europe. The main one is the solar resource. I don't know the exact number, but the radiation in the northern part of Chile is at least 60% better than in Europe. So that makes a big difference because the cost of a heliostat or a mirror or a tower is pretty similar, but with the same cost, you can get 60% more power. That makes the technology more competitive. And then second, there has been significant improvements in technology design in the last few years. There's a lot of investment right now in research and development to make this even more efficient in terms of size of the heliostat, what type of combination of salts you use. Some salts, I mean, it's in the news that we currently work in the range of 600 Celsius, and there's talk about 1,000 degrees Celsius. So with more temperature difference between cold and hot, you can generate a lot more power. So I think I'm very optimistic in the technology in Chile. I think the south of the US will benefit a lot from this technology. Obviously, it doesn't work everywhere in the world, but where it works, it does it very well. And particularly because it provides flexible power. You're not affected by a cloud going through the solar field, or you're not affected by suddenly the wind stop blowing. So that's something that complements very well, actually, PV and wind. Just more in general, I think we need to have a little bit more focus in what we want. The problem I see, at least in my industry, is that we talk to the people that has been converted and not to the people that hasn't been converted. We need to polish our message. We need to craft the message to convince the people that need to change, not the people that has already changed. And I see a lot of that in a lot of these conferences, and we're talking to ourselves how good we are, but not talking to the people that we need on board on this. And again, as I mentioned in the presentation, it's about aligning incentives with objectives. Without that, we'll not get this done.
Thank you, Fernando. So we have few time left. I think we will get 3-4 questions from the audience. And yeah, please.
Thank you. My name is Elias Albaili. I'm from the Central Bank of Chile. So I have many questions, so I had to pick one. Just to Fernando, picking up on what you said at the very end, do you think the concentrated solar technologies have the potential of making water desalination a viable solution to stopping the desertification? If I'm not wrong, I think we see a speed of desertification in Chile at least of around 20 kilometers per year. So the desert is basically going down at that speed, which is kind of scary. Maybe one way of stopping that is using the water from the ocean, but that's quite expensive in terms of the energy required. So maybe this technology has the potential of doing that?
I think there's the water usage and water availability is critical. This technology uses a lot more less water than other baseload conventional plants. We were looking at some numbers last week where a gas combined cycle uses about 3% of the water than a coal-fired unit needs, and our plant uses 5% of what a combined cycle unit needs. So by switching to renewables, you actually help reduce the need for potable water. Obviously, if you have, unless you have a flexible desalination plant that only works during the day, you need to have base load power. So I think this technology, it's a good combination for a desalination plant.
Thank you. My name is John Mary Odoi from Uganda. I'd like to ask you about the soil, although you said you're not an expert in soil. But I think my concern is that I think we need to match the issue of food security and the utilization of soil against the modern technology that's coming in order to have more food being produced. And I see a lot of chemicals, so many things are being used on the soil to try and make it maybe more productive. But I feel that I think that soil or the chemicals that are being used are a little bit dangerous, and I think they are going to disorganize the structures and whatever about the soil. So I don't know what efforts are being done to harmonize that. Let me also ask you a question about the cities. I know we need to have our cities modern and so on, but I believe that comes with a lot of projects, a lot of development, a lot of things that are likely to affect perhaps the social setup of the people. Is there any human rights component that is considered as you're trying to set up some of these projects that are going to make maybe cities better cities to live in?
So before beginning, I would also just like to mention on the desalinization issue, we also have to ask ourselves where the salt goes, because taking it out means it has to go somewhere. And so we have to be careful that it's not actually contaminating and that we're able to use it effectively. And we do know of cases where putting the salt back into the ocean has actually changed the quality of ocean resources with very negative environmental impacts. So it's important for us to think about it in the whole ecosystem. This issue of how does one ensure increased productivity while also managing and holding carbon as effectively as possible through our systems is an important one. We do know that the use of fertilizers actually has, while it has a big impact initially on plant growth, it also has a significant impact on emissions. And agricultural emissions aren't just, they're nitric oxide and methane primarily. And so there is a negative environmental impact of the inputs that we're using to enhance food production. So many of the systems that we're looking at now are mixed mosaic-like systems that allow for different uses of space, including which kind of satisfy the human need, which is not just, a lot of our separation between resilience and adaptation and mitigation is more of an analytical one. When you're talking about people on the ground, they have to do multiple things at the same time as they're trying to live. And so they need food, they need sometimes energy, having a section for your woodlot, having a section, and for your forest, having a section of your farm, having a section for water, having a section where you live, and coming up with optimal combinations in these mosaics is important. We also think it's very important to try to ensure that the forests, the native forests that are nearby farms, they really need to be maintained, and not just maintained, enhanced. So finding ways of breaking the fragmentation that currently exists and rebuilding corridors so that we can not just increase the carbon sequestration, but also enhance biodiversity. There's that dual need that we have. The reality is that farming is something that isn't just good for food. If it's done right, it can also provide a lot of other ecosystem services. So if we manage our soils well, we're able to ensure that that the nutrients are recycled, that water is held within the soil, that the soil is more porous, and therefore the plants grow better. So there's a lot of benefits that come when we engage in sustainable soil management and carbon-oriented sustainable soil management. And as I said before, these practices don't have to be complex, but they do require knowledge, and they are knowledge intense. And sometimes this knowledge comes from unsuspecting places. I mean, in Chile, what we've found is that sometimes it's indigenous peoples who have an incredible amount of knowledge that enable us to use extreme environments and cultivate in extreme environments and maintain biodiversity in extreme environments where really there would not be pretty much any other use for those areas. So they're able to bring about livelihoods, economic benefits, and also environmental benefits simultaneously. So I agree, we need to listen. I think we need to listen too. We talk about dialogue, but the risk of dialogue is that we're just talking across. We all have to learn to listen, and we have to learn to listen to people we don't normally listen to. And that means that power differential and that status that's associated with power that makes it difficult to open one's ears, we have to find a way to break that down and for once really, really listen to indigenous peoples, rural women, youth, family farmers, some of the people who have been invisible.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's good that coming from Uganda that all the major urbanization that's coming is in Africa. So when Latin America went through in 50s to the 70s and 80s, and then Asia, Africa is going to define the urban century, which is the current century. So, and yeah, human rights. No one's ever really defined what is the urban. Students say, well, what is urban? You say, well, density. And I found a very good definition, which is collective consumption. In cities, we depend on network network energy, network water, principally. And so when we think about human rights, it's in the city. With economies of scale, we should be able to provide that more efficiently than very decentralized rural communities. And it's been very expensive, very difficult to assure rural electrification, rural sanitation, rural water supply. But we know with the rates and the velocity of the urbanization in Africa at the moment and Asia and Latin America before, we've failed to keep up with those demands. So we have tremendous problems with people living in risk areas, which clearly doesn't satisfy their human rights to live safely, according to the Universal Declaration of 48 or any other since then. So in terms of food, in terms of housing and sanitation, we have to think about human rights. They are human rights, and states have an obligation to ensure that those rights are met. So in a sense, when the problem in Latin America and Chile, Ecuador, perhaps what we've seen recently, Chile in particular, when those demands are supposedly being met through the market, and those services are increasingly expensive, because we have private service providers generally, that's been the big model from Johannesburg on. The big thing in Johannesburg 2002 was we're going to have private service providers because they're more efficient. Well, they have to charge market rates. So we have to think about the pricing of these services, these collective consumption services, because people in the cities aren't producing their own water, aren't producing their own food, aren't producing their own construction materials. So they are dependent. So we need states that are aware of that obligation. And when we see things as a human right, the role of the state in these services and in these infrastructures is absolutely fundamental. And what we've seen in Chile is precisely that crisis. It's a crisis in the role of the state, in ensuring that the cost of these basic needs are not charged at market prices to which people cannot accede to those basic services, basic needs. And so we have to think about the role of the state again. And this is about the discussion about post-neoliberalism. And in Chile, we had a most extreme version of that. And the new constitution will hopefully define a new model of development in which the state and the responsibilities of the state and human rights are put above private property rights in terms of the basic ways in which states and economies function.
Last question, please, and short answer, and thank you.
Okay, I'll skip one of the two questions. And maybe, in fact, it is not a question, it is a suggestion. I would suggest maybe connecting our two urban and IPCC experts. Why wouldn't we release a special report for the built environment from IPCC until now? If you considered about 30% of the carbon emissions worldwide, I would suggest the sustainable design strategies of the urban form, the infra and the systems, and I mean, towards decarbonizing cities, we have to highlight those design strategies, maybe the retrofitting methods, the cost, and the payback period for such retrofitting. This is a very big issue, I consider it. Thank you.
Yeah, it is a very big issue, and the IPCC has indeed considered it. Actually, I don't know the exact term, but the built environment and urbanization is one of the cross-cutting themes over this AR6 assessment cycle, and the IPCC has already earmarked one of its special reports for the next assessment cycle. So that will be starting in 2023, if I'm not wrong, exactly on, I don't know the title, but on cities, let's say cities. And I also want to highlight that for the special report on 1.5 degrees, we actually worked, some of the lead authors of the report worked together with C40 and the Global Covenant of Mayors to translate what is in that report for urban policymakers. So there is now a summary for urban policymakers. If you Google it, you can find it, where really all the things that were presented in general are put in the context of what city policymakers would be interested in and what speaks to their reality on the ground.
The last assessment report showed that it's in buildings and urban infrastructure that the greatest gains are to be made. I mean, the efficiencies in industry and transport, those have been accelerating very quickly, and the new generation, the real opportunity, the low-hanging fruit, are in buildings precisely. And a little criticism to the IPCC, I was involved in sort of writing the bit on cities in Latin America in chapter 27. It's a chapter that's about 100 pages. Most people in Latin America live in cities, and with Patti Romero, we had 2 pages to write about cities. So, yeah, it's about putting these issues, moving beyond the basic sciences into, you know, the need for action, and clearly in buildings and the types of buildings we still produce, because the models, the economic models of cost of benefit and returns are part of the old-fashioned model. They're completely inadequate for the needs.
As a code of conduct, I mean, let's consider IPCC to release that special report to be considered as a global code for urban built environment design with all the issues we have all mentioned. I mean, it is not enough for a chapter in the IPCC Impel 6 or whatever. I mean, a code of conduct from the IPCC.
A quick response. I mean, it would be great if the IPCC could do something like that, but I don't think that it's within the mandate of the IPCC. The IPCC, unfortunately, needs to be policy neutral. So whereas a report on cities is definitely possible, it will have to, by its principle, have to show everything. And then policymakers take the decision. This is the parts we want, and so this is what we put in our building codes. So even there, I think the report will have to show everything. Also the types of city development we don't like.
Last year, Cynthia Rosenzweig and others published the second report on cities and climate change. It's called ARC3, which, because of the IPCC was very slow to think about cities in the urban century, she decided, well, we're going to do one ourselves. And she's worked on this. This is the second report that came out last year. The first was in 2014, which sort of put some of these issues to the fore. And there are very strong overlaps with the IPCC's work. But my problem with what you say is that I think there are very good suggestions from science about efficiency in buildings, good design, and we get tremendous resistance from the building companies because this hikes up the price of the buildings, and it's not what they want. So we have very good proposals for thermal standards and thermal efficiency, and these are resisted by the Cámara de Construcción in Chile because it's not. They're arguing for different standards. So we have there's an issue about the developers themselves and how quick they want to move forward with the standards we know that need to be put in place.
So thank you very much to all of you. We come now, we start a new panel. It's called Nature-Based Solutions. There is a soil expert who will talk about that and other experts also. So thank you very much to all of you for this interesting panel, and thank you.